All right, I think we'll get started. My name is Nathan Chapman. I'm the CTO at Generation E. And this morning we're going to talk about the Modern Meeting Success Framework. The Success Framework is a tool that we developed over the last few years in response to a few observations and also as a way to standardize our approach, how we approach meeting room design and meeting experience. So some of the observations I've seen over the last few years is that we have lots of client interactions and organizations that are looking to deploy meeting room solutions. And we started to see a sort of a theme of how they engage integrators like ourselves to do that. And that was that they're not always thinking about the broader picture and the whole solution. Often it's about, we want video conferencing for our meeting rooms. Can you give us a proposal that just a technology to put in that room? But there's a lot more to getting a great meeting experience out of meeting rooms than just the AV kit and the PC kit. So that's really one of the key aspects of why we developed this framework. And the other was to drive more consistent approach in our own processes and how we guide customers through this journey. So there was a precursor to the Modern Meeting Success Framework. Several years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago, we developed actually a UC Success Framework. Again, for a similar reason, this was developed for us to have a standard approach for doing Microsoft Skype for Business and link deployments at the time. It was mostly oriented around on-premise based solutions. But again, we found that there was a lot of clients that we talked to weren't understanding of all the different dependencies that were required for UC deployments and to get success. So this was a tool that we developed to help, again, guide that discussion and have a standard way of approaching UC projects that covered the infrastructure. Even before that, from the vision and scoping and budget and executive engagement through the infrastructure network, voice, video, app development, change management, and ongoing operations. And part of that was actually there's a video component in here that's that covered desktop, room, and interop. And the Modern Meeting Success Framework is really a kind of an expansion of this part of the UC Success Framework. We also have a design philosophy that we use when approaching meeting room design. So we think of this as a lens that we apply the Modern Meeting Success Framework to. The core principle of this design philosophy is being productive in meetings in less than 60 seconds. So as many people would probably agree with and have seen before, many meetings can take up to 15 minutes to actually get productive. By the time people get into the room, get connected to the laptop and get their meeting connected and dialed in and whatever, there's a lot of time wasted. So we set an objective to try to make meetings productive in less than 60 seconds. So within a minute of walking into the room, everyone's connected online and actually doing what the meeting was meant to be about. So to do that, there's a few key aspects that we call out to try to achieve that. The first is minimizing the use case scenarios. So if you look at the majority of meeting room solutions that we deploy, they share fairly consistent and common use cases. Such as presenting to a display in a room, doing an audio or video conference, or maybe ad hoc dial out. And then some may also have some interaction and ideations and whiteboarding aspects of it as well. But by minimizing those use cases and avoiding the temptation to try to do too many things in that room, having lots of different inputs and outputs, having Foxtel and TV and this and that, if we can make that as concise as possible, we actually minimize the controls. And if we minimize the controls, it means there's less buttons, potentially no buttons for users to have to worry about pushing in the room to get in between them and their experience. Another key aspect we find makes a big difference is avoiding resident PCs or room PCs in rooms. If you've got to go into a room and then have to log in with a keyboard and mouse, that can be guaranteed that'll break your 60-second experience. One of the challenges with that is that often where we see resident PCs and room PCs deployed is where the organization does not have laptops or mobile computing to all users. So in some cases, there's still a need to have those PCs in meeting rooms, and there's also some other niche cases. Again, all these principles are just general rules. There's often exceptions to these for special cases. But they're good principles to stick with. Also, by avoiding projectors in rooms, that can really improve the time it takes to get engaged in a room. So we typically use commercial flat panel displays in rooms. If you need to wait for a projector to turn on and if a screen to drop, again, you lose a lot of time in that meeting. Another key concept is what we call zero-touch presentation. So not all rooms are video conferencing enabled. So we just have a room where you want to go in and present. We talk about a zero-touch presentation. So you should be able to walk into a room and plug in to an HDMI cable, hopefully with the appropriate adapters already in that room. And then your content from your device should just appear on that screen. There should be no remote controls or anything to worry about. Stuff just plugs in and works. It's sort of what we hear from a lot of people is just, I just want it to be simple. It turns out making it simple is not as simple as many people think. But these are some of the approaches we could use to achieve that. Another is one-touch meeting join. So if it is a video audio conferencing meeting, having the ability to schedule that meeting ahead of time and walk into the room and touch one button in the room to join and have all the remote participants. That's kind of the minimum bar for video conferencing these days, we find, in terms of meeting experience. Another one to consider is just alignment with other technologies and investments. Things like making sure that the actual solutions that you're deploying in your rooms are aligned with your UC and your meetings platform. And that's kind of what we'll touch more in the success framework. But even things like wireless internet and guest access, that they kind of together as part of that meeting experience, especially for external guests that come in. Often they need to get connected to the internet to present some information. So making that easy to do as well. So this is the modern meeting success framework. So we've divided it into a number of streams from planning through to a number of room aspects and down to network and platform and operations. So we often summarize the room elements there in just one sort of larger category of room, but these elements in that room stream, they're all different aspects of the audio visual or the environmental conditions of that room. So there's quite a lot of things just to think about in that itself. And that's kind of typically what we see most people talking about when they're looking at a meeting room solution, is that's the obvious stuff that they need to do. What isn't as obvious is the other parts of this framework, particularly in the networking platform. So in a typical RFQ that we see, and I still see these today, I've had seen tenders come out in the last week or so where the same sort of thing happens, is that they're asking for a room solution and they have requirements around quality and multi-party calling and recording and all these sort of good requirements that you want to have. But the reality is a number of those requirements are not met by what the scope of the RFQ is. They're not actually part of the AV solution. They're actually features of the platform or features of the network and the performance of that network. So that's kind of one of the key things that this success framework is about, is realizing these dependencies to get meeting success. So what we'll do for the rest of the session, we're going to step through a number of these attributes in these streams. We won't be able to cover all of this because the whole framework to go through could take weeks, potentially, depending on the scope what you're looking at. But I want to call out some key aspects of this. So if we're going to have a success framework, we need to first of all define what success is. So we need to think about what does success mean for a meeting experience and for a project around meeting room experiences. So who is it successful for? Are you measuring it success for your end users, or is it based on the company's vision or what management are trying to achieve? How are we going to measure that? There's a number of ways to do that. Some people might look at support tickets as an example of, if we have few support tickets in it for these meeting room solutions and that is successful. One thing to consider is a lot of things that happen and go wrong in meeting rooms often aren't logged as support tickets. So while that can be useful insight to look at, it shouldn't be the only one. Probably what's more useful to look at is actually metrics around adoption and utilization, because they tend to be a better sign that you're getting good engagement and good success with that. Depending on what solution you're deploying the different tools that you can use to do that. We specialize in Microsoft sort of optimized, so Microsoft Skype for Business and Teams optimized rooms, but you'll find that this sort of session, this framework is really applicable to any sort of platform and approach. But again, depending on what platforms and tools you've got, there's different ways to get metrics. So usually the platform will have analytics in there. So with Microsoft Skype for Business Online and Teams, there's some great reporting around usage and adoption, quality metrics there about call quality. And so some of that is actually measuring call quality, not just about the AV equipment in the room and the platform, but also it gives you some insights as to if you're having issues in your network as well. Doing surveys to try to get more of that sort of qualitative analysis as well can be useful. So there's a number of ways you can get those success metrics, but before you sort of start this journey, it's a good idea to actually think about what your goal is. I want to touch on budget slightly, not so much about the actual numbers of the budget, but putting that in a bit of context. So a few years ago, Jones Lang LaSalle released a study that talked about this idea of a 330-300 rule. I put a link there to go and check it out, and I suggest it's an interesting read. Basically, the concept of this study is that if you're looking at real estate costs, 330 and 300 represent dollar values relative to a square foot of real estate per year. So 3 is how much your costs are for utilities and energy. 30 represents the actual real estate costs, whereas 300 is the actual cost of the people in the company who use those rooms and that real estate. So it's interesting to put that in perspective. And when I read that, it sort of inspired me to do a little bit more research and modeling around the total cost of ownership for meeting rooms. So I started to build out a model around TCO for meeting rooms. So looking at the costs just from the design, deployment, and operation of rooms and support of those rooms. So this is still a bit of a work in progress, but this is kind of what some of the earlier findings, which would start to align with that JLL finding as well. And based on that modeling at the moment, about 60 to 70% of the cost of a meeting room over a 5-year period is actually in the real estate. So the other parts that you'll see in that is there's a percentage of it being the technology, so that's the audio-visual and VC solution itself, ongoing support costs around that room, the furniture in that room, and there's energy there. The energy actually in the model at the moment is only the energy that's used by the AV kit. I've got to do some more work and get the numbers around HVAC and lighting and things as well. So at the moment, that's the ratio between energy and real estate is a little bit out from the JLL model, but when we add in the lighting and HVAC costs for heating and cooling, that probably starts to align. So that's something that I'm continuing to work on, sort of something out of interest in my spare time, but again, it gives you some context about meeting rooms and meeting experiences and budget. And then you can start to think about, well, what is the cost of not having successful meetings? You're spending all this money on the real estate and the people, regardless of whether the room is used or not, and whether people are productive or not. If you can get people productive in there, you can start to build a much stronger case for these investments. I'm going to go through some of the room aspects now. So I don't want to dive too much into actual products and stuff, but I'll cover off on some key concepts that are sort of fairly recurring themes that I talk about with clients. First of all, in displays, one thing that I often get requested in people asking for a room solution is saying, like, 2 displays up on the front of this boardroom, one for content, one for video. And that's been a fairly common way to deploy boardrooms in the past. Probably for a number of reasons, because that's the way that the old video conferencing codecs work and were optimized, so you can split those things out. But what's becoming more prevalent these days is that content in meetings is usually much more important than the actual video of a remote participant. The video is also important and gives you that those non-verbal cues and adds to communication. But the content is becoming really critical, particularly if you're looking at detailed information. If you're trying to review a Word document or an Excel document, you need to be able to see that clearly. So in a typical room, if we're looking at a dual display solution, well, generally find that we'll have to have two smaller displays as opposed to one larger display. That means that the maximum size of your content is going to be smaller if we go dual screens. It seems like a good idea when you first think about it, but when you actually think about the layouts and the size of the screens, generally we find that doing a single larger screen uses about the same less wall space, because the wall space at the end of a room is often a limiting factor as well, especially if the walls are recessed or you've got columns, things in the way. And with the layouts that we have in solutions and video conferencing systems that we're using today, particularly in Microsoft Teams rooms, there's a number of layouts you can choose from. So you can have video full screen, you can have content full screen, or you can have a combination of content and video, maximizing the screen real estate depending on what your focus is at that time. We get a lot of questions about what screen size is recommended. So all of our guidance is generally informed by industry standards. So if you haven't checked out AVIXA before, AVIXA is kind of a global industry standards body for audiovisual industry. And they publish a number of standards, including things around screen size. Their tool for screen size is much more complex than the table that's here. There's a lot more to it, but this is kind of a much more simplified version of this. So that table shows screen size in diagonal in inches, because that's typically how you'll see screens advertised and marketed. And then it shows the viewing distance for general viewing and detailed viewing in meters. So for a 55-inch screen, your participants should be between 4.2 and 5.6 meters. So 4.2 meters, so closer if it's a more detailed viewing, if you're looking at like documents, Word documents, Excel, or more detailed analysis. But if it is more for just video content and maybe sort of PowerPoint presentations where you've got fairly large fonts and things, then you can go back to that general viewing distance. So that there is a guide you can use for planning that. Moving on to cameras. So again, I'm not going to go through all the different models of cameras. There's some photos I've put in there just to show you some examples of them. But one of the key things to look at in the camera selection in rooms is the horizontal field of view that camera can capture in the room. So we see these days a lot of these huddle rooms being deployed where they're often probably even smaller sometimes than that one on the left there, where the participants are actually sitting quite close to the camera. So when that happens, you need a very wide field of view camera to actually get those people that are sitting close to the camera. So there's a range of cameras around these days that do 120-degree field of view, so it allows you to capture people close up to the camera. Moving out to rooms where the table is away from the wall, you can have a narrower field of view, so stepping up to sort of the more common PTZ cameras around these days. Most of them are 90-degree field of view, so these Logitech ones that we use are 90 degrees. They can zoom in closer if you need to go as well, but usually we're focusing on the widest field of view so we can fit people in. Some of the more traditional cameras and that are around in PTZ go down to 72.5 or even lower, depending on the cameras as well. But so this is sort of that around the 72 degrees is the next sort of field of view that we see. So the basic way of just assessing which ones are right is just looking at the floor plan view like this, and we can mark up the floor plan with that angle and make sure that the camera view is actually going to get all your participants in. With regard to audio, there's a few components of the audio. There's the microphones and speakers, and then amplifiers, and then DSPs for audio processing as well. Again, without going through a lot of detail, there's a couple of categories of solutions we typically see in a meeting room that it said will depend on the nature of the room. So for those huddle rooms, these integrated soundbar type solutions are very common, and they're much easier to deploy, keeping your cabling simpler and deployment easier. So they have speakers and microphone arrays integrated all in one unit, and these ones usually have the camera into that as well. So they're suitable for a given range. Typically it's those small and maybe up to medium-sized rooms, but in the larger, longer rooms, don't usually recommend that sort of solution. You need to look at putting microphones further down the room, either on the table or on the ceiling. So there's a range of table microphones. Some can be daisy chained. Some have smarts in them that do some tracking and organization as well, and you can have multiples of those. You've got some that are like the Polycom Trio you can use as the audio device in a room that has the speaker and the microphones all integrated into the one unit. Whereas others might just have a microphone on the table and then be using a front of room sound bars or maybe ceiling or wall speakers. Ceiling microphones can be useful if you want to get more things off the table and reduce the clutter on the table, or perhaps there's challenges in getting cabling to the table as well. But microphones are typically, VC solutions will incorporate some sort of audio processing. Some of the all-in-one units, sort of like the sound bars, will have that DSP audio processing component built into it. Whereas others, when you get into sort of ceiling microphones, typically they're a separate appliance that these things connect to. Audio is probably the hardest bit to get right, and often one of the most expensive things to get right, to get really good quality audio in a room. Start sort of adding up to when you've got to add in all this processing and speakers and amplifiers and microphones. But there's a good range of solutions around these days that allow us to do that. And of course, we've got amplifiers depending on the number of the type of speakers. Interestingly, now we're seeing there's a number of manufacturers that have PoE amplifiers, and that's kind of a trend that's happening in the AV industry. There's lots of things being IP enabled, but also PoE enabled. So we're working on some concepts at the moment of basically having pure IP meeting rooms where pretty much every device is IP connected and largely PoE powered. So that means that it becomes much easier to plan and deploy a room. You just need to put a bunch of data points around and make sure you've got the switching and PoE capacity for them. Moving on to content inputs and connections. So one of the things we get a lot of requests for is wireless content. So wireless content solutions can be really great. We've done a lot of Surface Hub deployments, and we use that a lot internally as well, and had a really great wireless content solution based on Miracast that was built into that and worked quite reliably. But with any of the solutions, any of the wireless content solutions, my view is none of them are what I would say are 100% reliable. For various reasons, it might be because you've got a guest that comes in that has a lockdown PC that can't plug in the USB dongle or can't connect to the wireless network, or some of them require you to be on a particular network to use them, and it can take time to get onto that network and not too hard. So I typically always recommend having a wide backup connection, even when you're deploying wireless. So having the HDMI input there as an alternative to the wireless is highly recommended. And when doing that as well, I've got some images there. There's a number of adapter sort of solutions that we'd suggest you consider, so that when someone comes into that room, if they don't happen to have their adapter for the USB-C video output, you can kind of put all these video adapters and attach them to the cable so they can't be stolen. If you have those in the room, again, it comes back to that being productive in less than 60 seconds. There's less messing around trying to find the right adapter and cable to connect. Everything should just be there, ready to go. Another consideration, and probably one of the biggest challenges when doing what we call retrofit rooms, where we're deploying into an existing room, is power and data and getting cabling to the table. So this is just a kind of a high-level diagram, just showing some of the cable routing for a solution in a room. Often we're going to need power and data at the table, and then we're going to need some cabling to get signals back to the display and back to the camera and things as well. So there's a number of ways we can do that using extenders and that sort of thing, but one requirement that we generally have to have is power and data at the table. So that is one of the key considerations when planning for your rooms as well. If you don't have that in there, it can be expensive and messy if you've got to do core drilling and concrete chasing and stuff to get that put back in this construction. If you're planning a new fit out where there's going to be construction works, it's much easier to get that integrated into the projects ahead of time. But do consider that. In fact, if you are planning any fit outs, it's good to engage early with an integrator to get that advice of, at least at a high level, of things you need to be thinking about. But ideally, some detailed designs of how these things are going to be connected and what the infrastructure requirements will be. So moving down from the room now into the platform. So when we say platform, we're meaning the video conferencing or meetings service that you're using for your meetings in rooms. So in this case, we're sort of assuming there's an audio or video conferencing enabled rooms. So there's a whole range of platforms out there in the market that you might be using. Each of them have different features and capabilities. And again, this is where I see a lot of RFQs and things that will talk a lot about these features and capabilities as part of the AV RFQ. And generally, they're not features of the AV solution itself. It's actually features of the platform. So when choosing a platform, you choose a platform that's got the right features and capabilities for you, but then make sure that your AV and the video conferencing solution is aligned and supported by that platform. In particular for Microsoft Skype for Business and Teams these days, is Microsoft's really supporting two solutions in meeting rooms, two categories of solutions, if you like. One is what they now call Microsoft Teams Rooms, which was formerly known as Skype Room Systems V2, and the other is Surface Hub. So at the moment, we deployed probably over 250 or so Microsoft Teams Rooms or Skype Room Systems. And gained a lot of experience of how to deploy them, how to manage them, and how to optimize those. One of the key reasons for aligning with those solutions for Microsoft Teams in particular is that one, as noted on there, anyone using Skype for Business Online will eventually going to be transitioned to Microsoft Teams. So anyone considering new investments in room solutions today should be looking at these Microsoft Teams room solutions, because even if you're on Skype Online today, you'll most likely be transitioned across to Teams as part of that move. So Microsoft Teams rooms work both for Skype for Business, on-premise, online, and Microsoft Teams. The location of your platform and in particular the MCU, which is the conferencing bridge, so where your media flows go, your audio and video, where those flows go, is important when thinking about room experience as well. I've had a customer before that was planning a rollout, and they came to market asking for video conferencing solution in the room, and they said, we've already got all the platform stuff. It's some video infrastructure we've got deployed, and it's managed by our guys in the US, and the MCU happens to be in the US. But their requirements were they wanted high quality calls with their local customers in Australia. But for them, that meant that all their calls, when they're doing multi-party calls, would be bridged all the way in the US. So it's adding significant latency and having limited bandwidth to do that. So again, you need to think about the infrastructure and the platform as part of that mini experience, in particular, where your infrastructure is located and how you are getting to that network infrastructure, networks you're traversing. Another kind of particular style of meeting is what we call in Teams now live events. Also in Skype was called Skype broadcast meetings. These are large scale meetings that can have up to 10,000 participants in them. Basically what happens with these events is it has one media stream that goes up to the Microsoft Cloud, and then from there it streams individual streams back to each attendee of the meeting. These are really great if you're doing external broadcasts. So such as this meeting is actually run as a Teams live event. So the stream is going from our office in Richmond at the moment up to Microsoft Cloud, and then being streamed out to all the participants on this call. So in this case, most of our participants are out on the internet and consuming that from the Microsoft Cloud. But a lot of people are using this platform also for town hall meetings or internal communications, right? So if you're doing this style of event, you're going to actually end up streaming a lot of this back inside your network. You need to plan carefully around that bandwidth management. And typically that will involve them deploying what's called an enterprise content delivery network. So Collective is a partner that's we've worked with in Australia that's done a lot of work in this space and is supported by Microsoft for Teams live events. And essentially what they do is they optimize and consolidate and aggregate those streams so that you're not sending 10,000 streams back inside your network. It's using sort of multicast and content distribution mechanisms to optimize that flow and reduce the impact on your network. Also with the platforms, depending on what solution you're using, they'll all have a different language or VC signaling, as we call it, of talking to that platform. So older video conferencing systems used to use H323, and a lot of it shift to SIP. A lot of the web-based ones use WebRTC or proprietary services, web-based services. So there's all sorts of different platforms out there, and at some stage you're often going to need to interop and get a call from the platform that you've chosen to invest in to someone else, whether it's a customer or a supplier or partner. So that brings in what we call this concept of interop. And there's two key parts to that. One is sometimes interop is done to support a legacy fleet you've got. So you might have a significant investment in all the video conferencing systems that maybe they were not purchased too long ago, so you still need to get some more return out of them. There are ways to make legacy devices and solutions work with Skype Business and Teams through interop solutions from companies like Exip and Polycom. You've also got cases where you might be wanting to bring in and invite external participants. So if you've say invested in Microsoft optimized meeting rooms and using that for all your internal meetings, it's all happy days. But at some point you want to invite some external party that may not be using Teams. Like having an interop solution, you can give them the sort of on-ramp so that they can get into your meetings using whatever technology they've invested in. So we talk about that as sort of respecting the technology investment that other organizations have made as well. So the interop, they can be done at a platform level with companies like Exit, Polycom, and BlueJeans is also a supporter one for Microsoft Teams. Or another approach can be doing interop at the device level. So some meeting rooms these days are deployed in BYD sort of style, where the room may have a display, an audio and video camera. There's no dedicated codec or video conferencing system in there. It's dependent on you bringing your laptop or device, plugging into the equipment in that room and running that meeting from your device. And when you use a room in that way, the software that your device is running is kind of agnostic. It could be running WebEx or GoToMeeting or Zoom or whatever. You're really just using the audio video components of that room. So that's one way we see people sort of try to do interop. So they may have some rooms that are designed as that BYOD room. Typically having that room, because you've got to have that connection, it's got to discover the camera and things on your laptop. It takes a little bit longer, so you may risk sort of overshooting that sort of 60-second objective. But there can be a place for sometimes deploying some of them. The other ways we can do it is with the Microsoft Teams rooms, you can actually dial out to Zoom and BlueJeans rooms. We've put them into the Active Directory contact list, so you can actually look up, type in Zoom in the address book, and it dials out to the Zoom IVR. So even though your system is actually only talking Skype for Business and Teams, it's actually using the interop capabilities in Zoom or BlueJeans to be able to get into that meeting. So there is ways that you can do that even with Microsoft Teams rooms. Moving down now into network. And again, I'm just pointing out, I'm not stepping through every single one of these. So again, I'm just pick out a few of these things to talk about. But one particular one that's becoming increasingly important is the switches and PoE in particular. As I mentioned before, there's lots of devices coming to market that are IP connected and PoE powered. PoE in particular, the PoE power budgets are really increasing. Again, we start talking about amplifiers that they're using the full capacity of the PoE power budget typically, and then doing some trickery within devices to buffer that energy so that they can still reproduce good sound and bass, even though they're limited to 15 or 30 watts. But because there's so many IP connected devices in the meeting room these days, really to keep an eye on port capacities as well. Often when we're designing a solution there, or we see an RFQ, that they'll often state that the network is not in scope, so it's going to be done by others, and you probably want that aligned with the rest of your network. But you do need to pay attention to those network requirements because they are getting quite significant. The other thing that's happening in the industry, there's a lot of solutions that are categorized as AV over IP. So we're transmitting audio and video traffic over IP protocols between devices in a room to get signals around a room between rooms. Video in particular takes quite an enormous amount of bandwidth, especially high quality uncompressed video. So the cat sort of 6 cables and stuff you see connecting devices that are not necessarily IP, but they can be 18 gigabits per second of bandwidth in a typical video stream between devices these days. So putting them on the network, they're generally compressed down to sub gigabit, but they're really pushing the limits of your network switches. So you also need to make sure that you actually have non-blocking switches that can actually handle all of the ports pretty much at full load, because the AV equipment will really push the boundaries of your network equipment. Also, if you've got these traffic running between switches, you need to make sure that your uplink capacities again are appropriate. If we're routing video signals around a network switch and each of those signals is pushing 1 gigabit of throughput, you've got many of them and you have to go through another switch. You need to make sure that those uplinks and bottlenecks are sized accordingly. A lot of these audio and video devices are also using IP multicast or layer 2 multicast, so that's a combination of layer 2 and layer 3 multicast. Multicast needs to be handled carefully in a network. If it's not configured correctly, multicast becomes broadcast, which means it goes out everywhere. It can interfere with other applications and slow things down. Also, if it's not configured correctly, it may not actually get to its destination as well. So close attention needs to be paid to multicast. There's a lot of things that use multicast, including Apple AirPlay and sort of underlying Bonjour protocols that are around these days. So it is becoming fairly common, but it's something that needs to be as well. There's also some protocols in the AV industry that are actually kind of standards, but they're not necessarily widely deployed. So one in particular that we see in some of the products we use is a protocol called AVB. It's an audio and video protocol for transmitting signals around, but it's not supported by all switches. There's only a handful of switch manufacturers that support it. So we have to choose the appropriate devices and make sure that those solution is supportable on the network as well. With regard to Wi-Fi, people and most companies we talk to would have Wi-Fi deployed these days, but not all Wi-Fi is equal. So Wi-Fi is probably important for the Mini experience for a couple of reasons. One, as I said earlier, it's important as part of getting people guest internet access in the meeting room, because often that's part of the Mini experience. But also it's often used as part of a wireless presentation solution. So making sure that they can connect to that and it's reliable and it can actually handle real-time traffic is to be considered. The other thing to think about with these wireless presentation solutions is that many of them have a Wi-Fi radio in there. And if you deploy lots of these in a building, you're putting extra Wi-Fi radios in every meeting room. Each of those radios is an additional interferer as well with the rest of your wireless networks or other wireless communication as well. So just one thing to consider before you sort of roll out any of the solutions for wireless content is just consider are you actually adding more issues with adding more Wi-Fi interference. So some solutions like Crestron's Air Media as an example, they actually don't have a radio in them. They rely on using your infrastructure wireless. So if you want to use those, you would connect your guest to your guest wireless and you configure your firewalls and your networks such that your guest network can access the wireless media, wireless content device so that they can still present, but obviously you don't want them giving them access to the rest of your corporate. So that's where, again, it leads into the next section, which is designing your security zones and firewalls addressing as well. One common thing that I see come up with is the idea of VLANing and subnetting. Generally, yes, it's a good idea, but I often see that people don't necessarily understand why they should be doing it. There's I still see lots of people think about VLANing and of doing things like voice VLANs. So I've got that diagram there sort of showing what I would call some of an old school VLAN and subnet design. you've sort of separated traffic in distinct categories. The challenge with that old school approach as we moved into the UC era is that those lines become a lot more blurry. So these days, many people use their computer as their telephone, as their video conferencing device. So you can't have that computer really be transmitting traffic on multiple VLANs at the same time. You've got to actually converge these networks. So separating just based on the category of application is not necessarily the right way to design VLAN and subnetting. There are reasons to do it. VLAN and subnetting is primarily for broadcast containment, particularly when we talk about that multicast traffic that's on the network. It is an important aspect of that. It's also a useful tool when designing security zones as well. So you may use these VLANs as a way to create security zones. An example would be that wireless content device, so like a Crestron Air Media. If you put that in its own VLAN, then you can configure your firewalls so that clients and guests can get to that VLAN without accessing the rest of your network. The other thing it can help with is IP address management as well, because we're adding, again, a lot of devices that are IP connected in meeting rooms. There's a lot of IP addressing to manage as well, and using VLANing and subnetting will help. Moving down onto operations. So with all those IP devices we talked about being added, it's a lot more devices that need to be patched and maintained. An interesting stat I saw recently is IoT devices are expected to reach about 50 billion by 2020. So these are all IP devices, and you'll see a lot of the AV industry are now talking about AV devices as IoT, because that essentially they are. They're all IP connected devices, generally managed by some cloud or software platform, have sensors and inputs and outputs on them, really fall into the category of IoT. So with so many of these devices being deployed, you need to consider how are you going to update them, because these things will generally going to need security updates and bug fixes and maybe new features you want to deploy as well. So often we think about patch management, it's often about servers and PCs and that sort of thing, but the prevalence of attacks on these IoT devices and AV devices in particular is becoming quite significant. So one of the earliest cases of attacking in these sort of non-PC devices is that Stuxnet example, where a nation state created an attack to actually attack a nuclear facility in Iran and took down a nuclear facility by targeting vulnerabilities in IP connected devices on a network. A more recent example, I just saw this one the last few weeks, is actually some older video conferencing systems that haven't been patched are actually vulnerable to IoT botnets. So there's botnets that have attacked recently significant deployments of video conferencing systems that are out there. So the risks are real and significant here. So you need to think about how are you mitigating these, and how are you going to be able to deploy easily and rapidly updates to mitigate this. I think a lot of this onus needs to go back onto the manufacturers as well. So this is an ongoing discussion and challenge, I think, as well, that when we're looking at the solutions we're using, we need to be holding manufacturers accountable for providing those updates, not only for providing the updates, in particular security updates, but also providing deployment mechanisms for them as well. And then moving on to analytics and optimization. As we said at the start, we need to think about success and how to measure that. So generally these analytics and optimization sort of aspects is a key tool that you can use for doing that. So as your rooms are being used over the years, you want to keep an eye on the performance of those rooms and then the experiences in the platform and the network associated with it. The capacity of your rooms. Do you have enough rooms? When are they utilized? What are the peak utilizations? You may be able to optimize use of meeting spaces. But also you can start to get behavioral insights as well about how rooms are used and how people are using it. There's lots of sensors around these days can be deployed to get interesting insights about how people are moving through buildings and facilities and how meeting rooms are used. So that sort of bit of a overall view on some of the key aspects of the modern meeting success framework. Again, we haven't had time to dive into each one, but I've called out a few particular ones. But as you can see, it covers a number of areas, and I guess where Generation E comes in is we're a company that's been built specifically to address all of these. Our focus is on modern productivity outcomes, and meeting room experiences kind of represent the pinnacle of that. In that you'll see that in our practices that we specialize in, all of them are very relevant to the media experience, from the UC platforms and digital collaboration platforms through the audio visual components themselves, but then also the network and underlying security mechanisms that support them as well. So starting to summarize, some key takeaways I think I'd suggest for you is determine how your success will be measured. Again, think about what does success look like and what tools and measurements are you going to use to be able to confirm that you've achieved what you set out to achieve at the start. One, I guess, way to probably summarize that framework and some of the key elements of it is to think about the room, the network, and the platform. If you're addressing those three key things, then you've got a good chance of getting a good meeting experience, but you've always got to keep those three concepts in mind. Again, the framework is a bit broader than that as well, going into operations and planning, but if you think about those three core concepts, then you set up for a good result. Also, so the framework is broader, so have a look at the rest of them as well. Some of them, not every attribute in the framework is relevant in every meeting room, so some might not be relevant. So the framework was designed to accommodate for video conferencing rooms. Again, not every room is video conferencing enabled. It might just be a display or might just be a phone. So you can sort of skip past some of those if they're not relevant. But if you're going to be deploying these rooms and working with partners to do that, we recommend choosing partners that actually have experience and expertise across those key elements, particularly in the room, the network, and the platform as well, and particularly in the platform that you're chosen to use. So in summary, if you've got you want to find out any more information about the framework, we've got consulting services that we have to sort of guide customers through that framework more formally, to take you through that sort of journey. But also, if you've got any plans for any meeting room fit out or upgrades, reach out to either your account manager or myself. There's a couple of offers we'll be coming out with soon as well. See, the ones around room booking solutions. So we've got a packaged offer, basically a per room cost for deploying room booking panels and the associated integration and installation of that. And another area that we've been doing quite a lot of work with recently is around live events. So again, this meeting is using a Teams live event. So we've been designing and deploying a number of solutions recently for both corporates, but also government, things like local councils that actually have, in some states now, there's a legal requirement for them to stream their council meetings to the public as well. So we've got a range of solutions that can be designed for that. So some of them actually even they're broadcast out to Facebook or whatever platform we want, but we're working on ways that we can really simplify that experience of deploying and operating those solutions. So I think we've opened up a Q&A as well. So if anyone has got any questions, the session is being recorded, so there'll be a link sent out so you can that recording. So all the slide content there will be in the here as well. Another minute or so to see if there's any questions, but if not, thank you all for your time, and hopefully you've got something useful from today's session. Okay, we've got a question about design for ceiling audio and speakers, and I think it's with regard to rooms that are reconfigurable. So this is a fairly common thing we do. It's so reconfigurable rooms where there's adjoining walls, they often have also movable furniture that's not fixed as well. So it represents a number of challenges from AV design and operation point of view. Typically, though, the way to handle that is by using ceiling microphones and ceiling speakers. Basically, because the furniture is movable in a room, if we run cabling to that table, it needs to be disconnected from floor boxes, and inevitably those cables and things get damaged. So we try to avoid as much as possible any cabling to tables in rooms where the furniture is movable or reconfigurable. Now, where the rooms are joinable, there's particular solutions where we can zone the microphones and the speakers and even switch cameras between different rooms and modes of those meeting rooms. So there's good solutions we've got to do that neatly. One thing I would advise against doing is trying to switch USB devices. So it's something we certainly know from experience doesn't work well. A lot of the cameras and audio devices on the VC solutions these days are USB connected. But if you try to switch that USB device on one codec and switch to different cameras or switch the camera to different codecs, you'll have a lot of stability issues. So it needs to be done in a way that maintains a consistent USB connection. So we've got some solutions, and QSC has some good solutions that we use regularly for those more complex rooms that are joinable. With regard to the audio itself, again, yes, we would get the audio generally in the ceiling. Ideally, if it's ceiling tiles ceiling, it's very easy to get that in. If it's a plaster set ceiling, it can be more challenging. We may need access hatches and things put in to be able to get the services up there. But yeah, the audio solutions can be designed and deployed so that they're in the ceiling and also configurable based on zones that match the configuration of the room. So we've got another question around the integrated solutions for that. I think you're talking about those sort of soundbar solutions. I think someone's suggesting they've heard mixed reviews. I'd suggest that they're good for the room sizes that they're designed for. Again, when you think about mic performance, a general principle of microphones is the closer the microphone is to someone's mouth, the better the quality of the audio will be. So as you get into larger rooms, the audio performance of the microphones, first of all, will start to struggle. Of course, in any given room, the acoustics of that room make a massive difference as well. But generally, those soundbars, so the ones that we use a lot of is the the Logitech Meetup, and there's some new ones recently being released from Polycom Studio, and Crestron has one as well. It's also part of their Flex solutions. They work, I find, well for the sizes, which is usually a small to medium room. So that the Meetup is probably better for the smaller rooms. The microphones perform well. Where they start to be limited is sometimes in the actual speaker performance. The Meetup speakers, because of the physical size of the device, is not as large as other speakers can be. the audio output from the speakers can be limited. So particularly if you put in a large room, it sounds a bit weak in the audio. But it's generally quite good in a smaller room. Again, 3 or 4 people around a huddle table is ideal. The Polycom Studio, it's recently been released. It's because it's physically bigger, the sound out of the speakers, and that we find is probably a little better. Probably can go to a bit bigger room. So generally, yeah, again, my feedback would be those solutions are great for the room sizes, which is that small to medium size. When I say medium, maybe up to 8 people in a room, typically depends on the layout of the room. Yeah, going into larger rooms, then we'd usually use a separate camera and microphones and speakers for those. All right, so that's all the questions. Thanks again, everyone, for your time today. Hope you got something out of it.